back to Raising the Stakes, the part of Steak Bites that takes you behind the scenes of Colorado craft beef and puts Kara in the interview seat. I'm your guest host, Jay Knight, head of marketing at CCB, and today we'll be unpacking one of our favorite topics: what actually makes a great steak. And we're not just going to, it's not just about the great steak, but we're going to be delving into meat science. Let's get to basics, I guess. Where does a great steak start?
So we think that all of the meat science side starts after cattle are converted to meat to beef, right? The reality is it starts way before that. So these animals are set up for what they're going to do genetically, you know, even preconception. Then there's a huge impact that actually happens in utero as well for these animals to be able to reach their genetic potential. Then you start pulling all of the environmental factors in. So how that's going to be able to impact that animal to be able to grow properly, be able to what we call marble, which means they're able to lay down that intramuscular fat, which is part of the equation of a high quality steak. So if you're going to say something's prime or choice or however you want to grade that, that is a big piece of the puzzle. And we'll get into that later. But the reality is all of this starts way before these animals actually are even conceived.
Yeah, and you're getting that consistency across. I mean, it's not like you're just focused on that one steer and its life. You're focused on the herd, and so what does it take to be able to manage that consistency um, across the entire environment that these animals are living in?
So, consistency is a great topic of conversation for this because the beef industry, comparatively to the other protein industries, that is our biggest Achilles heel. And it also makes it the one of the biggest opportunities because these cattle are able to graze in so many different types of environments, which means that they really need to be different types of animals for these different types of environments that they're in, which can lead to inconsistency when we start, harvesting meat from these animals. So we have big, we have little, we have ones that can thrive down in the southeast that have a little more, ear and to be resistant to bugs. So it's a different, type of animals, it's different breed. Comparatively to the further north you go, they need to be able to withstand these harsh winters and a lot of the environmental challenges that frankly the hog and chicken industry doesn't really have because their environments are very controlled. So they figured out how the genetics are the most streamlined, and that turns into a very consistent product once they harvest those animals. Yet we don't really have that in the beef industry because our animals are very different because our environment is very different. But that's something that we have looked to, I would say, tackle at Colorado Craft Beef is how to increase the consistency of the beef product that you get from us. And there's a lot of things at play at that. So, of course, the genetic side of these animals, we typically stick with an Angus base type of animal because we know the marbling characteristics they have, and they also thrive in our environment. So we're blessed in that. Typically, it's a black Angus, but Angus actually can be red as well. And there's some different variants as far as the genetic side of the animals that go into the program. But that's where we start is looking at the genetic side to make sure they have the highest propensity to be able to have a great product at the end, and they also match our environment well. But that's not the only piece of the puzzle. We have other, I would say, safeguards that we've put in place as far as how we process, how we raise these animals, how we process these animals to have a consistent product in size, in quality, and in an eating experience when somebody sits down at their table.
Hmm. And so going one step beyond the environment, I think a big portion of what probably most people growing up and listening about people talk about the food they eat. Maybe they're trying to think about being more aware of where their food comes from. I think most entry points for somebody when they're looking at like, oh, what goes into a great piece of beef, a great steak, comes down to the feed and the we'll say the food life cycle of the animal, and how important is getting the feed and finish right, because I think that's, correct me if I'm wrong, a huge part of the puzzle.
It is a big piece of the puzzle. And I mean, I went to school to be a ruminant nutritionist, so a cow nutritionist by trade, and we focused on the feeding side. I mean, that definitely does impact the quality of that product once it reaches your plate. But there's other pieces that need to be a part of that puzzle as well. So there's two things when it comes to actually grading a carcass. So if you're going to have, of course, prime and choice are the two that most people are more familiar with. And there's two things that need to be top notch for that, or they need to be at the highest level to be able to be eligible for those USDA grades. And age or maturity is one of them. So that's also something that we do focus on, is having I wouldn't say an older animal, because you do reach a threshold, but a more mature animal that still can be graded in that frame of reference. So with the USDA, that basically is 30 months of age and younger for an animal to be able to be eligible to be graded prime and choice. That's what we call an A maturity, is under 30 months of age. You can move into a B maturity, which is 30 months to 42 months, and still be eligible, but then they'd have to have that much more marbling or intramuscular fat to be, say, prime graded. So maturity is a big piece of that. And we typically like to extend that life cycle on our grass pastures. So allowing animals to reach that maturity, that basically that what you're doing at that point is you're growing frame on these animals. So reach their genetic potential as far as a frame, and then moving into the finishing stage where you're essentially adding finish or fat, which leads to the intramuscular marbling, the intramuscular fat. That is another piece of the equation when you actually grade an animal to be eligible for prime choice. I mean, select is another one, but we're targeting a high choice plus animal with our finishing system, with our entire supply chain. And the big equation of that is the maturity of the animal, and then the finish, which is that level of fat, which sometimes there's kind of a misnomer. So we need an animal to reach their genetic potential. Like that's the way we like to think about it, is they reach their ultimate genetic potential. And within that, their frame or their skeleton, the frame of that animal needs to reach a certain level before they start to lay down fat. Otherwise, those resources that are going into that animal are going to growing frame and bone and body size versus the actual, the fat level of finishing that animal, which typically that really kind of mild corn finished flavor that you taste from a high-end steakhouse, literally anywhere, typically comes from we call it corn finish, but it's energy. It's an energy level of an animal to be able to lay down that fat, because they have to lay down back fat first, and then the intramuscular marbling comes, which is where that grading actually comes from. Is so once an animal's harvested, you cut between the 12th and 13th rib, and that's where you look at the eye of that rib, the rib eye, for lack of a better term here. You look at the rib eye, and that's where that grade is actually coming from. And it's based on the amount of intramuscular fat, those flecks of white that you see on that rib eye is where that's actually coming from. And then once that grade is assigned, it's actually assigned to that entire carcass. So it's not just, oh, well, it was a prime New York. Like, that's not actually the way that works. It comes from that entire carcass, and that is where that grade is assigned, is when you look at that rib eye between the 12th and 13th rib. And you'll be very hard pressed to achieve that type of quality grade without a high energy finishing system.
Mhm. So we've gone from talking about genetics, and then we moved into feed and nutrition and finishing, talking about the marbling, and the marbling still needs to be enhanced by a meat cutter who really knows what they're doing. And so the next stage of this is the harvesting and the dry aging. I mean, there's other types of aging, but for us, it's the dry aging of the beef. And so that last stage right there, well, not last stage where we're kind of in charge. The final stage is when the customers get involved and they make their own steak. But um, what really helps enhance that steak experience during the harvesting and dry aging phase?
So that's a good question. And I had to change the way that I thought about the beef industry. I was always have been on the live animal side. I've been on the cattle production side of this industry. And then I went to college and started learning more about meat science and realized that even if we do everything right on the live animal side, that could be messed up in a heartbeat on the meat side once that animal is actually converted into beef. So that changed my frame of reference around a lot of what we do and how we do it. It's still incredibly important to make sure that we are, guiding the genetics and we're taking care of these animals so they can have the highest quality life and reach their full potential. Yet, so much of that eating experience still does come down to the end of life process and what you do with a knife. That is huge. So, as far as it goes, when you're converting these animals into protein, into beef, is making sure everything was right up until that point, yet making sure that's also as low stress as possible, because that does not only impact the animal's end of life, that quality of life, but it does impact the meat quality as well. So you stress an animal at the harvest facility, that's where you could end up with things like a dark cutter, which basically that depletes the entire glycogen stores in those muscles, and then you get that really, really deep red.
Yeah.
That's not, it's not good for the animals. It's not a good eating experience. So making sure that process is as seamless as it possibly can be. And there's interventions that we've put in place to make that end of life as quick and seamless. I want to say painless, but when you utilize we use a captive bolt gun, so that renders that animal unconscious. And then what actually stops the life is when you bleed an animal out. So basically, that's from the carotid artery. But they don't feel that because of the captive bolt gun. So that's a big piece of the entire process. And then making sure that your crew is very skilled with what they do. And in that, a big thing that can make a difference is your cooler settings. So you want to make sure that the temperature of that, at that point, that carcass comes down at the appropriate rate to make sure that you're not souring anything. That's where you could end up with bone sour if your cooler settings are not right. So the cooler settings are a big piece of that. Making sure that you have all of your quality control in place to make sure that food safety is top notch. That's also another piece of that puzzle. And for us personally, something that we can do different than a lot of the large harvest facilities is that dry aging process. So once that animal is harvested and then they're split into two sides, they're hung in our dry aging cooler for us 21 days. And that process, it basically it's an enzymatic breakdown process. So it breaks down a lot of, the connective tissue within that animal that could be more chewy, that you could end up with that. So really it impacts the tenderness, and with the dry aging process it impacts flavor. Because you think about a dry aging process, it allows a lot more moisture to leave the muscles, to leave the carcass, the beef. And so it really concentrates that flavor, which that
Mhm.
flavor is more of a earthy is not the right tone, but it is more like beefy. It's a more concentrated beefy flavor in every cut that you experience from Colorado craft beef, because we are physically able to leave that carcass hanging as a half carcass in our dry aging cooler for 21 days. It does make a big difference. So if you think about the commercial harvest facilities, typically it's like 3 to 5 days from the time that animal is harvested until they're being cut and they're out the door. Otherwise, it's an operational failure. So
Mhm.
for us, just being smaller scale, we're able to do some things that you just aren't able to do in the commercial chain.
And since we've started as Colorado Craft Beef, we've had a 21-day dry age program, and that's really been non-negotiable. Um, and it seems like that has really driven both the flavor and, me speaking as a non-meat nerd, how tender the beef is, and how great that plating experience, and sitting there and eating and enjoying the company around you. It just enhances everything.
Mhm.
um why the 21 day? It seems like it's a non-negotiable, but is 21 the standard? Is 21 the standard that you came up with for CCB? I know that I've heard from other parts of the industry, other people that I've worked with or talked with, some people say 14 days. So what are we getting at 21 days?
21 was kind of the sweet spot of the operational side, because of course you harvest other animals behind these ones that are still in the cooler, so you need to be able to have appropriate space for that. So you have an operational piece of looking at the puzzle, and then you have the science piece. And the science is pretty clear that you continue to get added benefits up to, actually the breaking point is 35 days. Yet the added benefit from 21 to 35 really, as far as the science is concerned, wasn't significant enough to offset the operational side of going from 21 to 35.
Okay.
You see the most benefit from a meat science perspective up to that 21-day mark without additional water loss. Because that is a big piece of the aging process that we're actually taking on as Colorado craft beef. Is there's weight that's lost with that. It's water weight. But if you're purchasing a steak from, say the grocery store, that weight is still accounted for in that cut of beef. We have taken on that as CCB because we know that eating experience is more enhanced, even though there's less weight to that product.
And so from the genetics and the decision making, and then uh, you know the timeline of being on pasture, to the attention to detail when it comes to cutting, to dry aging, like all of, you say science, but when you were saying that, I was thinking like this is the craft part of Colorado craft beef, the attention to detail at every single stage, and being intentional about, like, how we're doing something. We It's not just the cattle go on pasture this week. It's no, the cattle are going on pasture at 6 a.m. on this day because we know such and such and such, and we're responding to the weather. We're responding to the needs of the environment. The needs of personnel always falls into it, but um, you really come to appreciate, and me being the inside outsider who gets to come in and see everything. Anyway, I just wanted to point out it really feels like that the craft part really comes out, especially hearing you talk today.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, I love the craft thought process of it, but also we have kind of tied that into the intentionality of what we do. And that's something stepping back into the industry, because our family ranch is generational. I'm fifth generation. Our little girls are sixth. Yet, I did try to take that step back and look at it from a frame of reference of two things actually. Just because Grandpa did it doesn't necessarily mean maybe we should. So let's think about that. And then the other one was just because we can, should we? And that's where that kind of intentionality came into it of let's really understand why we're doing what we're doing and think about the how of what we're doing. And we do think about it in the frame of reference of our consumer, which sometimes we lose that in the industry, is we forget about that person at the table enjoying that product that we've produced for them. So we keep that customer first mindset to make sure that everything that we do, we can easily have that conversation with our customer of why we're doing it and why it matters. And then we put all of our how pieces together with that. But our frame of reference is a little different.
And that big change has happened in the last 10 years when it comes to thinking about the end state of the product that you are helping create, whether you're just a piece of the supply chain or you're completely vertically integrated. Um, what what was it like seeing that transition? You've talked about this before, where there's almost this realization at maybe an industry event where it's like, these customers are calling me and they want X, Y, and Z, or this isn't selling or that's selling now. Um, one thing that's happened recently is that beef tallow has become much more important to the American consumer, and so I'm just curious, what's it been like to watch in the span of I still think the last 10 years, um, the change in the industry towards focusing on the customer.
It's actually been really interesting because I started my career on the producer side of what we do. And that's what we kept talking about was what we do, how we do it, just, the sheer economics, all of the things that drive production. And then I noticed partway through my career in animal health, all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, we do have a consumer that's changing dramatically. And they want to understand more about what we do. And they're further removed from what we do than they ever have been. So how do we get back to that? And I don't mean this in a derogatory manner, but I was sitting in a room full of 65-plus-year-old white men. I mean, everybody really looked the same. There wasn't a whole lot of diversity in the room. I was one of the very few females, but also especially, a millennial female in the room. And we're sitting around talking about how we connect with a millennial consumer. We're a millennial mother. And I'm like, maybe this isn't the best room for that. So let's bring that frame of reference of the consumer to this conversation. And who better to do that than, I suppose, somebody that falls in that demographic. So that's where I pulled that thought process of, if not me, then who? I hate that kind of, that correlates in so many facets of life, particularly within the veteran space as well. But that was my thought process of are we going to stand around and complain about what's happening, or are we going to be part of the solution? And who better to do that than I ask somebody that can speak that language and understand some of the mindset and can bring a new, fresh perspective to this versus the generational perspective that we've had for a long time, because that is the average age. 60, 65 is the average age of a rancher in in the States, and it still is. So the demographic was kind of swayed, and not necessarily looking like our consumer. So I had to think about it differently, and try to bring that consumer back into our mindset from a production aspect too, and how I have the conversation around our production practices to somebody who doesn't know what we do. They don't know how we do it, and they definitely don't know why we do some things that we do on the ranch.
I mean, I still go back to when my dad first came out to the ranch with me, and he was just like, "I just thought they put the cattle out on the grass, and then they walked up the ramp, and that was it." So thank you for taking the time to talk about that. I kind of weaved a little bit, but we were talking about what makes a great steak. I mentioned earlier that the final part is actually in the hands of the customer, and we do have a lot of people that reach out that ask, "How do I cook this cut? What do I do here? What's the best way to do this? How do I use your beef tallow?" And we are answering those questions on our company blog, on social. We're going to be putting together some PDFs and stuff for people later in the year as we get ready for the holiday season. But in talking about what makes a great steak specifically, Carol, what are a few cuts that people might be sleeping on that you love? Before we dive into exactly what are a few of the cooking truths, but what are some cuts that we need to be looking at?
So most of the time, everybody thinks of the common ones, right? You think of a ribeye, you think of a fillet. Ground beef is obviously well known, and I love ground beef just as much as the next guy. But I think basically the part of that animal that gets lost is the sirloin. So
Mm,
whether it's top or bottom sirloin, the flavor in a sirloin is incredible. And it's not just the top sirloin. So we have other cuts that come from there. So the flap or the bavette comes from the sirloin as well. The picanha, that also comes from the sirloin, and a tri-tip.
mhm.
And they're all a little bit different in flavor, but they're all incredible. So don't forget about the sirloin. Like there is so much that comes from there that is kind of forgotten.
I mean, you just can't beat our tri-tip and picanha. I mean, every time we do a cook, it is always. I mean, it is the same, if not better, experience of like cutting into a ribeye or a tenderloin at a steakhouse. Now, the great thing about the picanha and the tri-tip is they're massive.
Yeah, you can feed
So
people with it.
yes, you will walk away from the dinner table feeling full and satisfied. Um, and so, what are a few cooking truths? Because there's a lot of ways to cook, and for us to go through it at the end of the podcast right now would be a little bit ridiculous. There's grilling, there's pan frying, there's reverse searing using an oven, sous vide. But what are a few cooking truths that people can lean on when they're thinking about trying to really enhance the finished product of their steak?
One big thing I would say is don't overcook your steak. You lose so much of the juiciness of that product when it is overcooked. So from especially a steak perspective, let's speak from food safety. If you reach that internal temperature to that, that threshold, you're not concerned about a food safety issue, right?
Mhm.
But a lot of times that has been the thought. Actually, I reel back to it was my grandfather's day when they ate a ton of mutton and they
Mhm.
cooked it because they didn't want it to, get them sick. So there's some misnomers on that, just because there's not liquid or red left in that product. You were safe a long time ago. So let's put it that way.
Right.
We don't have to cook it to death from a food safety perspective, and that will enhance your eating experience. I personally like the grill taste, that reaction that tastes great to me. Not everybody does, but that's something from my own perspective that makes a big difference for me. But our steaks actually are a little bit more forgiving because we have already aged So that
Mhm.
meat is naturally a little more tender. It already has pulled some of the additional moisture out, so it doesn't take as long to cook. There are some things that do make what you get from CCB a little more forgiving than what you may get in some other places.
And I think, to go back to talking about not overcooking the steak, um, I think what some people forget is that they need to rest the steak for about 5 minutes because it's still cooking. And it kind of helps even out that cook so that when you're cutting into the steak, you're getting that really beautiful medium rare red look that people are always showcasing on all of the cooking socials that at least we follow. We don't follow any socials where they overcook steaks, so there might be some out there, but yeah, don't forget to let the steak continue to cook on its own, let it cool down a little bit on its own, and then slice into it and serve.
Yeah, for sure.
So, is there anything else that you wanted to speak to regarding meat science? What goes into making a great steak? Do you have any final thoughts, Kara?
Appreciate the process. Um, that is, I would say, one of two differentiators within the beef industry is, the animal life cycle is quite a bit longer than it is for the other proteins. This process, the craft process starts, even prior to conception. So then you have 9 months of that animal in utero where you're building all those building blocks, and then typically they're, within our setting, 20 to 24 months ish, when they go to harvest. That's a long time. There's a lot of intentionality that has went into this product way before it ever ended up on your plate, and the hands that have touched it, and the people behind it, because there's different parts of this chain. So I would say that beef is, it's a premium protein for a reason. Not only, the entire process, that entire life cycle, all of the things that go into it, the fact that, these animals can utilize grass that we can't use for other things to produce in a superfood. Um, but really think about that when you sit down at the dinner table, that this is a process. This is a lot of people's life work. This is very intentional. There's so much that goes into producing that steak way before it ever hits your dinner table. So think about that, kind of savor that process, and the thought that this really is beef in general already started as a little more of a craft product because of that and the intentionality that goes into it.
Well, thank you, Kara. And to everyone, thank you for listening today. At Colorado Craft Beef, we're not just raising cattle, we're crafting quality from genetics and feed to dry aging and harvesting. It's all intentional. And now you know a little bit more about the science that goes into every single steak we sell. Thank you for listening to Raising the Stakes. If you've liked today's episode, please share it, review it, and better yet, taste it for yourself at coloradocraftbeef.com. Thank you.